my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this latest episode of the Leaving Babylon series. Now, we've talked about learning to think and act like Easterners within an Eastern covenant, and in the last episode, we talked about the Scriptures and how we need to view the Scriptures in their proper context as a way of knowing Elohim. And of course, knowing is not simply about acquiring information, it involves action. And knowing Him has more to do with the heart than it does with the head. And our walk with Elohim is the way that we get to know Him. And it's a relationship that develops and is forged and perfected through the covenant process. And actually what starts with the circumcision of the flesh ultimately culminates with the circumcision of the heart. That's a lesson that we learn through the Scriptures, but we need to actually live it out in our own life. So while we read about it in the Scriptures, we need to actually live it and experience it in our own personal lives. Now, the Scriptures provide us with instructions on how to live within the covenant, and those instructions are not just a bunch of do's and don'ts intended to put us into bondage, as many people think of the Old Testament and the Old Covenant. Rather, those instructions are a yoke meant to guide us and keep us on the covenant path. And of course, we're not supposed to be stiff-necked, as we talked about in a previous episode. We're supposed to be sensitive to that yoke so that those instructions can guide us and direct us and keep us on the straight path. An important part of those instructions involves the Moedim, also known as the appointed times. And the appointed times are literally appointments when those in the covenant with Yahweh are supposed to meet with Him. And we spoke about the weekly Sabbath right from the beginning of this series. And of course, that's easy enough to observe. All we need to do is count days, and every seventh day we understand that is a set-apart day called the Sabbath. And we already discussed the fact that the day begins in the evening and it continues an entire cycle through to the following evening. A day is a complete, full cycle. And of course, that's consistent with Hebrew thought and action, which is very cyclical in nature. And in fact, Hebrew time involves cycles. Now, there are some who are bringing confusion into the assembly by promoting notions such as the lunar Sabbath, or ideas that the Sabbath only involves the light portion of the seventh day. And actually, they go so far as to say that every day is only the light portion of the day. So what they're essentially doing is saying that a day begins in the morning, not in the evening, and it just goes from sunrise to sunset. And of course, what they're doing now is they're fracturing time, they're fragmenting these cycles, and it's causing great confusion for those that are trying to leave Babylon and start to live a Hebrew lifestyle according to a Hebrew reckoning of time. Most of these people that are promoting these ideas have gotten too caught up in acquiring knowledge, as we talked about in a previous episode, and it's almost become an obsession. Obviously we all understand that when we come out of Babylon, we need to recognize that we've learned some lies, we've inherited some false traditions, but you have to balance all of that. And everything that we've learned or everything that's known to mankind is not necessarily a lie. So we see a lot of people chasing all sorts of rabbit trails, and they end up running off cliffs, literally, because they're just they're going after things that just don't have any basis in the Scriptures in this quest to find new revelation. So we've got to be careful not to get consumed with the conspiracy theories and all that, and just take a real solid approach towards walking out the covenant. Now, the way that we do that is by keeping our focus on the Messiah and following Him. That's what He came to do. That He came to show us how to walk out the covenant amidst false traditions and false teachings, amidst religious people putting heavy burdens upon the Israelites. He was the example. So if we stay focused on Him and look at how He lived out the Torah, in his day, then that can keep us from chasing after all sorts of false teachings and doctrines. And his example was really about being a servant. And the entire point of us leaving the shackles of Babylon is so that we can freely serve in his kingdom. And again, remember, Babylon is a very self-centered culture. And part of the turning that we see in the repentance process involves turning the attention from ourselves to him and to others. And when we take the attention off ourselves, sometimes that's when we stop focusing on just acquiring knowledge, as we talked about. When we can carry that self-centered aspect of Babylon with us, even when we're trying to find truth, when all we're doing is just being obsessed with gaining more and more and more knowledge. So we've got to put our limitation on that, focus on Messiah, focus on others, and walk out the covenant path in that proper perspective. And of course, this is why the weekly Sabbath is so helpful on this journey. And here's a great promise that's provided through Isaiah 58 in verses 13 through 14. It says, "If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my set-apart day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the set-apart day of Yahweh honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in Yahuwah, and I will cause you to ride on high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of Yahweh has spoken." So this is a great promise that we have if we stop looking at things selfishly and focus on him. If we put our focus on him, then there are great blessings. And of course, if we start doing this on a weekly basis, we will have a balanced walk as we walk out this covenant. Now, the Sabbath is obviously a cycle that repeats every 7 days, and it's a very Eastern exercise, again, to look at time in cycles. The other Moedim require not only the counting of days, but also the counting of months. And to do that, you need to know when a month begins and when a year begins. And this is where most Westerners undergo a serious paradigm shift. We've all been raised under a pagan solar calendar, which fits 12 months into a 365-day year. And of course, that's the period of time required for the Earth to make one complete revolution around the sun, measured from one vernal equinox to another. Now, the vernal equinox, or also known as the spring equinox, is something that most Westerners really don't pay much attention to. In fact, I spent much of my Christian life completely oblivious to the machinations of the calendar that I lived under. And basically, most Christians, most Westerners are living under what's known as the Gregorian calendar, which was created by the Roman Catholic Church, that simply modified the Julian calendar, which was used by the Roman Empire. And these calendars are strictly based on the sun. They're solar calendars, and they have no interest in using the moon determining days, months, or years. And that's because, again, they derive from a solar pagan sun-worshipping system that really traces all the way back to Babylon. Now, the scriptures actually tell us that the Creator's calendar operates using the sun and the moon. And here's what we read in a common English translation of Genesis 1:14 through 16. It says, "Then God said, there will be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens, to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night." So notice we have 2 great lights, and we're given certain functions that they have. And the word for light in Hebrew is or. It's spelled Aleph, Vav, Resh. And even though this passage doesn't actually name these 2 great lights, we can discern from history and the scriptures that the 2 great lights referred to are the sun, which is Shemesh in Hebrew, and the moon, Yerach in Hebrew. and they divide the day from the night. And the sun rules the day, and the moon rules the night. And the sun actually emits the light, and the moon reflects the light. And of course, there's a great spiritual picture that we're given there as the sun, this light of the sun emanates from the Father, and then it's reflected by the moon, and the moon often refers to Israel. So these two great lights are for signs, seasons, days, and years. And in America, we just saw how these signs function as a solar eclipse crossed the entire nation on August 21st, 2017. Now, a solar eclipse occurs when the moon covers the sun and casts its shadow upon the earth. And of course, on the August 21st event, we saw this track of the moon's shadow. Obviously, the moon's not the same size as the sun, so it didn't cover the whole earth. It just created a path of its shadow on a certain track across the United States. Now, a lunar eclipse occurs when the shadow of the earth covers the moon. Now, these two signs are very predictable based upon the movements of the sun and the moon in a heliocentric model of the solar system, which is really the only model that can fully explain these two signs. Now, the second purpose that we read about in the Genesis 1:14 is seasons in the English language, but that translation often makes us think about winter, spring, summer, and fall. But that's really not an accurate rendering of this particular passage. The four seasons are really confined to the tilting of the earth and the light and heat of the sun, basically creating the seasons that we know, the hot of the summer and the cool and the cold of the winter. The different climate changes really are from the tilt of the earth and the sun. The actual word in Hebrew for the word that's translated as seasons is moedim. And of course, we've already talked about the fact that the moedim are appointed times. And we're going to discuss the actual appointed times in the next episode. For now, we simply want to talk about the calendar and state that most of these moedim occur on specific dates on specific months, except for one. So in order to determine the timing of the moedim, we need to determine not only days, but also months and years. So when we consider months, it's interesting because the appointed times are really specifically pegged to months. And so even though in a passage in Genesis 1:14 it says, for signs and for moedim, for days and years, when you consider moedim, you could almost insert months there, because you've got to have months for these moedim. Now, it's not the same word in the Hebrew, but the implication is we've got to be able to figure out months in order to know when to celebrate these moedim, which the scriptures tell us occur on specific months. The actual word for months in Hebrew is HaKodesh. Literally, it means the renewal, but it's translated as new moon in the English Bibles. And some Western thinkers get confused with this because the word Yerek is not seen in the Hebrew text. They want to see the words new moon, Yerek Kodesh, in the Hebrew text, but they don't see that. But that's really not necessary in the Hebrew. New moon is the same as HaKodesh, which means the renewal. And we already mentioned in the past episode about how there are different descriptions for the Torah, and the same holds true here. While the word for the heavenly body called the moon is Yerek, the word used to describe the renewal of the light of the moon as a sign for telling time, which determines the beginning of the month, is simply HaKodesh, the renewal. So the renewal occurs when the first sliver is sighted on the moon. And this really is without question when we look at history and the scriptures. And although there's some that, again, we have these false teachings floating around out there, and there's some teaching, this false conjunction hypothesis that really has no basis in being used in the history of the Israelites. Basically, it's teaching that when the earth, the moon, the sun are in conjunction, this alignment that occurs, which is just a moment in time, It's very brief. They're saying that's when the beginning of the month occurs. But the conjunction would have been, it was a very difficult calculation. It is a very difficult calculation. And there's no indication that the ancients used that to determine the new moon. We talked about the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. Now that's something that the ancients, all civilizations in ancient times, calculated very easily. In fact, some of the large structures that we see around the world actually were set up to determine the spring equinox, the vernal equinox, which would help them mark the beginning of the year. The conjunction, on the other hand, is a very difficult calculation, and there's no evidence that cultures use this moment to gauge the new month, the new moon. It's always was the first sliver. And it's important to remember that while the Israelites did fall away at times, there were times when they did things right. And we have to use those historical precedents to place the scriptures within their proper context. We can't just create new theories. The Israelites marked the renewed moon by the visible sighting of the first sliver, and they would blow shofars and actually set that day apart as a special day, a new moon day, a lot of times with celebrations and feastings and things of that sort. And in fact, I actually saw somebody tried to use one particular passage where David didn't appear for the new moon celebration, and Saul inquired, where he was, and they try to use that to justify the fact that the conjunction determined the new moon, but that's completely inaccurate. If you understand when that event actually occurred, the year and the month and the day, you can discern that the conjunction had nothing to do with this passage, and Israel was not following the conjunction at that time. So that's just one of those things we have to watch out for, because it creates a lot of confusion. You may look on your pagan calendar and see the dark moon as the conjunction, but again, that's an astronomical determination, and it's not a historical determination for the beginning of the month. Now, so this first sliver is actually how the great light and the lesser light show us the beginning of the month through light. Otherwise, you're just in dark. You're operating in darkness, and that's not how the Israelites determined the new moon and the month. They would blow shofars, set the day apart, and again, it's important to remember that the day begins in the evening, and this is very helpful because an important reason for the first sliver is because it's when we sight the first sliver of the new moon, that occurs in the evening after the sun has set. So right around when a day would begin, we can look up, and if we see that first sliver, we know, okay, this is the beginning of a new month. If you're using the conjunction, there's no coordination between the beginning of a day and being able to visibly mark that as the first day of the month. But when you're following the first sliver, again, the sun sets. Right after sunset is usually when you'll see the first sliver, and so the day is beginning because we're evening, the sun has set, and you look up, and if it's not the first sliver, you know that you're continuing in the prior month. If you do see the new sliver, you now know it's the first day of the new month. It coordinates and synchronizes beautifully. So from that point onward, once you see the first sliver of the new moon, the sun and the moon actually work in conjunction to count and mark the days of the month. You can actually look up at the moon pretty much any night and determine with a great degree of accuracy what day of the month it is until the moon goes fully dark. So when you get to know the phases of the moon, you can very accurately, if you lose count, determine what part of the month it is. And of course, then we wait until it goes dark, and after a couple days, we wait for the new moon to mark the beginning of the next month. So we can easily see how both the lights are used for signs, for moedim, and for days. Obviously, that's something we addressed earlier on in the series. Final question is years. Now, because the lunar year is approximately 354 days, it doesn't synchronize with a solar year, which is approximately 365 days. So in order for the sun and the moon to both be used to determine years, the ancient Israelites used what is often called the rule of the equinox. And essentially, after the end of month 12, the Israelites would determine the beginning of month 1 to be the new moon closest to the vernal equinox. So depending upon how things calculated, they would either go from month 12 to month 1, or they would go from month 12 and add a 13th month, and then to month 1. So, but that was easy for them to calculate. Again, as we said before, all the ancient cultures could easily discern the vernal equinox, and it was something that, it didn't take much to determine that every year. Now, the word equinox is simply a fancy term for describing the time when both day and night are equal, and this occurs 2 times during the year, at the time of the spring and at the time of the autumnal equinox. Now, we know that the scriptural year is to begin near the spring equinox because of the order of the appointed times, which dictates that the first Moedim, the Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread occur in month 1. And we read the following in Exodus 13, 3 through 10. It says, "And Moshe said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand Yahweh brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month of the Abib. And it shall be when Yahweh brings you into the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to Yahweh. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, This is done because of what Yahuwah did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you on your hand, and as a memorial between your eyes, that Yahweh's Torah may be in your mouth. For with the strong hand Yahweh has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its appointed time," which is moed in Hebrew, "from year to year." So notice that these appointed times occur in a specific month, and we're to keep them from year to year. So we need to be able to determine the months and the years. And also these occur in the month of the Abib. Now, many in the Hebrew roots movement get distracted by a Karaite tradition that teaches that the condition of the barley crops in the land of Israel determines the beginning of the year. Now, this is nothing but a man-made tradition, and it simply adds to the Torah. And of course, we're not supposed to add to or take away from the Torah. That's a specific commandment. The scriptures specifically say the sun and the moon are for years. And it states these 2 lights determine the years. It says nothing about a barley crop. Now, this false tradition goes on to teach that the word Abib refers to a specific state of the barley crops. Now, that state is determined subjectively by certain men, who then also make another subjective determination of whether there's sufficient Abib barley throughout the land of Israel before the end of month 12 in order to determine whether the next sighting of the new moon will be a month 1 or a month 13. Now, all of these subjective traditions, they don't comply with the Torah. And it's so riddled with errors and additions to the Torah that it should be obvious to people that it's an error. And I have to tell you that early on in my walk, this seemed like the way to go. Obviously, we're trying to determine the new year, and I was taught that, we have got to look for the barley crops. And I can't tell you the confusion that it rendered on certain years when there would be groups running out. And again, we're talking about on month 12, okay? There's nothing in the scriptures that says there has to be a beef barley in month 12, but people would go out and they'd be looking towards the end of month 12 for a beef barley. And then they would make declarations. Well, we don't have enough of beef barley in month 12 in order to call the next month, a month 1. And so you'd have these teams going out, and some people would agree, some people wouldn't. And in some cases, they're submitting, these Hebrew roots people are submitting to people that don't even believe in the Messiah for these determinations because they think that this is the way the scriptures tell it to be done. And again, I've had years where I've made plans and then I had to change those plans, cancel my tickets because people said, oh no, it's not month 1, it's going to be in month 13 because there's not enough of wheat barley in the land. And then I've heard reports at the last minute. Okay, now we have enough of wheat barley, so then I had to rebook my flights and rebook my hotel system. I mean, it was just absolute chaos. And of course, again, to people that don't know otherwise, that are new to this, it seems like, okay, well, I guess that's the way it's done. But you have to understand, these are all additions to the Torah. They're adding and taking away from the Torah. The Torah only talks about the sun and the moon determining years. So it's confusion, but it's something that I had to work out because I was actually living it. I had to see that like, this doesn't make sense. And, how could ancient Israelites go through this type of confusion if they had to travel? For instance, Yeshua and his family, they had to travel from Nazareth and they had to make plans and make preparations and then leave, quite some time before the feast would begin. So they couldn't have this type of last minute confusion all the time. And so as I walked it out, I realized, no, this does not conform with the scriptures. It's man-made. It's men adding to and taking away. And that's when I later understood, no, this is the ancient Israelites used the sun and the moon, just like the Torah tells us to do. So it's one of those examples of we can chase all these rabbit trails in theory if all we're doing is just accumulating knowledge in our heads. But if we start to walk it out, a lot of the confusion works itself out because we realize that this is just nonsense and it's not possible to function like this. And so that's why I encourage you not to get too caught up in different people, especially if they're not even doing it themselves. I mean, if these people are just putting up a YouTube channel and teaching from someplace in the world and they're not actually going to Israel and observing the appointed times 3 times a year and walking it out, then I don't give them much credibility because you got to be doing it in order to be teaching it. So sadly, many people have adopted this false teaching that derives from the Karaites because they haven't examined the Hebrew language completely either. In Hebrew, we read the month of the Aviv, Ha-Aviv, not just the month of Aviv. See, Aviv was not the name of the month, but rather it was the month of the Aviv, or the time of the Aviv. And in the scriptures, the days of the week and the months were simply numbered and counted. They were not named until the Israelites adopted that tradition much later. So month 1 was described as the month of the Aviv, but it was just simply month 1. The reason it was called the month of the Aviv was because not because of the barley crops necessarily. The word for barley is so'ora. While barley is the first grain crop to ripen, the time of the Aviv is when many things begin to turn green. And the word Aviv actually means green, springing forth, the renewal of life. So what we need to understand is that the Passover and unleavened bread occur in the month of the renewal of life, the time of springing forth, the time of green, the time that we often refer to as springtime. And of course, the word spring carries the same meaning as Aviv, springing forth. And this is particularly significant when we read the commandment in Deuteronomy 16:1. It says, observe the month of the Aviv and keep the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim. For in the month of the Aviv, Yahweh your Elohim brought you out of Egypt by night. So again, we're supposed to observe the month of the Aviv, Shamar. And Shamar et Chodesh HaAviv is what we read in Hebrew. And it's interesting because we see the Aleph Ta, the et, attached to month of the Aviv. Shamar et Chodesh HaAviv. So instead of Ha-Chodesh, like we read about before, here, when we're talking about the month of the Aviv and the Passover and unleavened bread, we read et Chodesh. So the Aleph Ta and the Messiah are specifically connected with this time of renewal, the renewal of the month and the renewal of the year, this time of refreshing. And the way that we ensure that the sun and the moon are used to place month one during the time of the Aviv, or the time of spring, is through the rule of the equinox. And it's important to realize that the current modern Jewish calendar, just like the Karaite calendar, is a traditional man-made calculated calendar. Only this time they developed it by the Pharisees. It was developed by Hillel II hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. And it doesn't use the sun and the moon to determine months and years. It uses a fixed calculated calendar, and it too is wrong. Like the Karaites, again, it adds to and takes away from the Torah. So if you're following a Pharisaic calendar or the Karaite calendar, then you're not following the Torah. You're actually following a man-made tradition. And again, this is another thing when people, they're leaving Babylon and they realize, okay, we've been under this pagan, solar calendar that comes from sun worship. Let me get over to the Jewish calendar. Well, a lot of people just jump right into the Pharisaic calendar, and without even realizing, wait a second, this is a man-made calendar too. This is just something that men calculated. They don't use the sun and the moon. They don't follow the Torah. So again, they go from one erroneous calendar to another erroneous calendar. And this is something that people really have got to get straightened out. I hear many people say, well, the Jews were the last ones to have control of the calendar through the Sanhedrin, so we need to follow that. And of course, that's just nonsense. I mean, you don't follow an error that you know to be wrong because somebody apparently had some authority. They didn't have the authority to change the Torah. And of course, this is one of the underlying arguments that Yeshua had with the Pharisees all along. They claimed that they could interpret the Torah, and they were basically changing the Torah by adding to and taking away from it. And this is why Yeshua rebuked them all the time. So why on earth would we follow the Pharisees when they do the same thing with the calendar? It's an absolute error, and we've got to get away from that. So highly advise you to not leave the solar calendar and go to the Jewish calendar or the Karaite calendar. Follow the calendar, the Creator's calendar, that uses the lights, the greater light and the lesser light, the sun and the moon, as prescribed through the Torah. Now, Yeshua told time just like all the Israelites. And like I said, in order to avoid going down these different rabbit holes, we should just simply look at Yeshua and follow him and do it like he did it. And what we see from his life is that he did things at the same time that Israel did things. And we know they were using the sun and the moon at that time. If there was an error in how they were observing the calendar, he would have certainly pointed it out, and he didn't. He pointed out all sorts of errors in their teachings and things, but he never said anything about the calendar. In fact, we always see him in Jerusalem for the feast, celebrating the same time that all of Israel was. And we can safely assume that it was the correct calendar because he walked, he taught, and he obeyed the Torah according to the popular calendar of Israel. And of course, there were other sects in Israel that were following different minority calendars, but Yeshua was following the primary calendar that the temple was following. And it's also the calendar, let's not forget this, that he used to fulfill the Torah as he was born and died on certain appointed times. And he sent his Spirit on an appointed time when all of Israel was gathered in Jerusalem from many nations to celebrate the appointed time of Shavuot. So actually, the set-apart Spirit also confirmed the calendar of the time. And we'll talk more about his fulfillment of those appointed times in the next episode. In the meantime, if you'd like more detailed information on the calendar and the appointed times, I suggest that you check out the Walk in the Light series book entitled Appointed Times. Until next time, my name is Todd Bennett. Shalom.